The chipped formica of the desk felt cold under my forearms. I was already logging the time. 11:03 p.m. into the digital register price. The day supervisor had just walked me through the system, mostly pointing and grunting. He smelled like stale coffee and something vaguely metallic, like he'd been working with old machinery. He hadn't offered much in the way of explanation, just a key ring heavy enough to anchor a small boat and a curt. Just follow the procedures. I needed this job, needed the insurance, needed to stop seeing the collection agency's number flash on my phone every other day. Lena's appointments, the new medication, it wasn't stopping, and the eviction notice wasn't getting any less real. The archive itself was substantial. Not grand, not impressive, just relentlessly there. Built in the 1960s, I guessed, all concrete and low ceilings. The main room was a vast grid of metal shelving, stretching back into shadow, rows and rows of file boxes, the kind that haven't been touched in decades. The air smelled like dust and old paper and something else, something faintly sweet and chemical like varnish. The fluorescent lights hummed, a constant low thrum that vibrated in your teeth after a while. There were offices lining one wall, all identical, and a smaller, restricted area at the far end cordoned off with a chain-link fence. The security cameras were everywhere, swiveling slowly, watching. I'd counted 7 just from the desk. The building was silent, utterly silent except for the hum and the occasional creak of the old structure settling. Price had pointed to a laminated sheet mounted next to the security monitor, a standard-issue beige thing with a peeling corner. Read those, they're specific. That was all he said. He hadn't looked at me when he said it, just adjusted his belt and headed for the door. I swiveled in the chair and read. 1. If you feel vibrations in the floor with no identifiable equipment source, stop what you are doing and move to the designated holding area. Wait until it stops. Vibrations? What kind of place had vibrations? Maybe it was just the trucks on Elm Street. The building wasn't exactly soundproof. I pictured it, a little tremor running through the concrete, and chuckled. They really covered everything, didn't they? 2. Do not enter Records Room B for any reason. Records Room B, okay. Good to know. Probably contained asbestos or something. They were usually pretty careful about that stuff. Still felt a little arbitrary. 3. If your radio or communication device experiences interference in a specific location, static, cutting out, wrong voices, log the location and time. Do not try to boost the signal. Right? Interference? That happened all the time with these old buildings. Bad wiring? I dealt with it at the hardware store, just a matter of finding the dead spot. 4. Keep a handwritten copy of the daily schedule and emergency contacts on your person at all times. Do not rely solely on your phone or the building system. Old school. I could appreciate that actually. Systems crashed, phones died. A pen and paper were reliable. Lena's number was already in my head anyway. 5. If a room that should be empty is locked from the inside, do not attempt to open it. Mark the door and note the time. Come back at the end of the shift. If still locked, report and do not investigate. That one felt odd. Locked from the inside. What was the point of specifying that? Anyone locking a room from the inside wasn't exactly trying to hide anything, were they? Probably just some old policy left over from when they worried about employees stealing paper clips. 6. Do not access personnel file 47B without authorization from UVA in Human Resources. Okay, now that was just weirdly specific. Personnel file 47B, who was so important or so problematic that they needed a dedicated rule. Probably some former employee with a grudge. I made a mental note to ask Price about it tomorrow, though I doubted he'd tell me anything. 7. After 2 a.m., never face the north wall while stationary. If you need to look, turn your whole body. Do not hold the position. I stared at that one. Never face the north wall? Seriously? What was that even supposed to prevent? I glanced at the north wall now, a long, blank expanse of cinder block. It looked like any other wall. I could see myself leaning against it during a slow shift, reading a book. The whole thing was starting to feel less like safety regulations and more like someone's eccentric hobby. It was probably something someone started years ago and no one bothered to remove. I almost laughed. 8. Do not look up in the atrium unless there is a specific work reason to do so. If you do look up, complete the task and look away. The atrium, right? The small, glass-covered space above the main entrance. I hadn't really looked up there yet, just noticed the skylights. I pictured myself needing to check a light bulb, quickly glancing up, then immediately looking back down. The absurdity of it all was almost comforting. A little bit of strangeness in a long, quiet night. I finished reading, folded the rules back up in my mind, and returned to the log. 11:07 p.m., nothing to report. The hum of the lights seemed louder now. I found myself unconsciously avoiding looking at the north wall, just in case. It wasn't worth the hassle. I shifted in the chair, adjusting the angle of the monitor. The Formica still felt cold. I was cataloging the old microfilms. Price hadn't said anything about it being a priority, just that it needed doing eventually. Boxes and boxes of the things, brittle and smelling like vinegar. It was tedious work, threading the film through the reader, adjusting the focus, and making notes about the contents. Mostly land deeds and tax records from the early 20th century. Dry stuff, but it kept my hands busy, which was good. Building the rocking chair in my head needed all the focus I could spare. I'd gotten the back supports curved just right, but I was still wrestling with the runners. They needed to be perfectly balanced. The microfilm reader was in the southwest corner of the main archive room, tucked between stacks of bound county reports. It wasn't a comfortable spot. The chair was plastic and cracked, and the air always felt a little colder there, even with the building's central heating. I'd been at it for almost 2 hours, meticulously logging each reel. Reel 37B, land transfer, Silas Blackwood to Bartholomew Finch, 1912. Reel 38A, property assessment, various landowners, 1915. It all blurred together after a while. I paused to stretch, my back protesting with a dull ache. I hadn't realized how long I'd been hunched over. The fluorescent lights above hummed steadily, a monotonous drone that blended into the background. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 1:47 a.m. Still a long stretch to go. I reached for my thermos, unscrewed the lid, and took a sip of lukewarm coffee. It tasted faintly metallic, probably from the thermos itself. I needed to clean it. That's when I felt it. A subtle vibration under my feet. At first I thought it was just a truck passing on the street outside, but the building was set back from the road, and the vibrations were different. Less of a rumble, more of a tremor, a high-frequency thrumming that I felt in my teeth. I frowned, trying to pinpoint the source. Nothing. No construction nearby, no obvious machinery running within the building. Just the hum of the lights and the low whir of the ventilation system. I dismissed it as probably the heating system kicking into high gear. The building was old, the pipes were probably rattling. It was a logical explanation. I went back to the microfilm, trying to refocus on the tiny images on the screen. But the vibration persisted, growing subtly stronger. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but a physical sensation, like standing on a large speaker. Then I remembered a fragment of the rules, surfacing from somewhere in the back of my mind. If you feel vibrations, no identifiable source holding area. It wasn't a precise memory, more of a feeling, a sense of urgency. Stop what you're doing, move. I didn't even question it. I quickly saved the last entry in my log, shut down the microfilm reader, and stood up. My legs felt slightly unsteady. The vibrations were definitely more noticeable now. I walked quickly, but not running, towards the designated holding area, a small, windowless room near the security desk. It was essentially a reinforced panic room, Price had said, though he hadn't elaborated. I entered the room and closed the heavy steel door behind me. The vibrations were still there, but noticeably muffled. I leaned against the cold metal of the door, listening. The thrumming continued, a low, insistent pulse. I glanced at my watch. 1:52 a.m. I counted the seconds, one by one. 10, 11, 12. The vibration steadily diminished, fading into silence. 15, 16, 17, until finally there was nothing. I stood there for another minute, listening intently. Nothing. I opened the door and stepped back into the main archive room. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The microfilm reader hummed quietly. The stacks of bound reports stood silent and imposing. The lights flickered slightly, but the vibration was gone. I checked my watch again, 1:55 a.m. Only 3 minutes had passed. I didn't bother logging it. What would I even write? Felt a vibration, went to the holding area. Vibration stopped. It felt pointless. I returned to the microfilm reader, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing towards the north wall, just in case. I adjusted the focus on the reader, but the images swam before my eyes. I needed a break. I needed to walk the perimeter again, and I needed to remember to ask Price if old buildings were prone to phantom vibrations. It was probably just that. Probably. I needed to finish cataloging the box of city ordinances from 1932. It was tedious work. Each document was brittle and yellowed. The ink faded in places. The box was heavy too, and the cardboard was starting to give way at the seams. I should have asked Price for a sturdier one, but Price wasn't exactly overflowing with helpfulness. He'd given me the rules, pointed vaguely towards the coffee machine, and then disappeared into his office, muttering something about historical preservation and the sanctity of the record. The ordinances themselves were surprisingly mundane. Regulations regarding street lighting, noise complaints, the proper disposal of garbage. Occasionally something odd would surface, a prohibition on fortune-telling within city limits, a detailed code governing the keeping of pigeons. I made a note of the pigeon ordinance, thinking maybe Selma, my wife, would find it amusing. She'd always liked birds, even the ones that left their mess on the fire escape. I was sorting through a stack of permits for outdoor advertising when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a sort of damp, earthy odor, like potting soil that's been left too long in a dark basement. I initially dismissed it as just the general smell of old paper and dust. The archive building was ancient, built in 1902, and it had that distinctive musty scent. But it got stronger. It wasn't just dust, it was organic, like something was decaying. The smell seemed to be coming from the east wing, specifically from the end of the hallway, near room 307. I glanced at the directory posted near the entrance. Room 307, restricted access, personnel only. Below that, in smaller print, a handwritten note, "Do not enter." I frowned. Price hadn't mentioned any restricted areas beyond the holding area, and he hadn't mentioned not entering rooms. Then it clicked. A flicker of memory, hazy and incomplete. Something about a room. A warning. Do not enter for any reason, consequences. It wasn't a clear recollection of a rule, more like a lingering dread attached to the idea of a specific place. I pictured the list, those typed lines on the faded paper, but I couldn't bring the exact wording to mind, just the feeling of wrongness. I told myself it was probably nothing, just an administrative office, maybe a storage room. Price was probably just being overly cautious. I needed to finish cataloging these ordinances. My shift was almost half over, and I was already behind schedule. I needed to get this done so I could get home to Selma. She was having a particularly bad day, the MS flaring up, and I'd promised to finish the rocking chair. She'd been looking forward to it. But the smell, it was getting stronger. And now I could hear something else. A faint scratching sound coming from behind the door of room 307. It was a dry, insistent scraping, like nails on wood. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a mouse? The building was old. Mice were inevitable. But it didn't sound like a mouse. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I remembered the feeling again, stronger this time. That chilling apprehension linked to the room, the incomplete rule fragment, consequences. I knew logically that I should just ignore it, finish the ordinances, report the smell to Price in the morning, but I couldn't shake the image of Selma, her face pale with pain, the rocking chair unfinished in the corner of our tiny living room. I needed to get home. And that's when I realized I needed something from the supply closet. It was just past room 307, a roll of archival tape. The cardboard box was about to fall apart, and I didn't want to risk damaging the documents. I could grab the tape quickly and then get back to work. It would take less than a minute. I walked towards the east wing, my steps hesitant. The smell was overpowering now, thick and cloying. The scratching sound continued, unwavering. I told myself it was just a mouse. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But as I reached the doorway to room 307, I stopped. I could see a sliver of darkness beneath the door, and the scratching, it had stopped. I reached for the archival tape in the supply closet, grabbed a roll, and hurried back to my station. But as I sat down, I realized I'd forgotten something. The last ordinance in the box. The one I'd been about to catalog before the smell started. It was a permit for a public gathering, dated December 24th, 1932. A Christmas Eve service to be held in room 307. I stared at the empty space in the stack of papers, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Selma would have to wait another night. The rocking chair would remain unfinished, and I had a feeling I wouldn't be sleeping well. I spent the next hour reboxing the city ordinances. It was tedious work. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and the cardboard felt brittle under my fingers. Each box was heavier than the last, filled with brittle paper and the ghosts of forgotten regulations. I kept glancing towards the east wing, towards room 307, but nothing. No smell, no scratching, just the oppressive silence of the archive. I found myself straightening the edges of the documents, meticulously aligning them within the boxes. It was a pointless task, really. No one ever looked at these things, but it gave me something to do, something other than think. Selma had called during my break. Her voice sounded weaker than usual. She hadn't slept well. The pain was constant, and she was frustrated with the lack of progress with her new medication. I tried to sound optimistic, told her I was making good time, that I'd be home soon to work on the rocking chair. It was a lie. I was nowhere near finished, and even if I was, the thought of facing that hallway again wasn't exactly encouraging. I'd promised her a comfortable place to rest, a little bit of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly out of control. I needed to deliver on that promise. I'd almost finished the last box when Price's voice crackled over the radio. "Kieran, check the perimeter. Motion sensor tripped near the loading dock. Just a routine check, probably a stray animal." I sighed. More walking, more silence. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the back of the building, trying to ignore the way my left knee protested with each step. It had been acting up lately, a dull ache that flared up in cold weather. I really needed to get it looked at, but, well, bills. The loading dock was as Price suspected. Empty. A scattering of leaves blown in from outside. I swept the beam of my flashlight along the walls, checking for any signs of forced entry. Nothing. I was about to radio back to Price when I noticed it. A faint static on the radio. It wasn't unusual. The signal in this part of the building was always spotty. I adjusted the frequency, trying to clear it up. More static. Then, briefly, a voice. Not Price's, not anyone I recognized. It was garbled, fragmented, like someone speaking through a broken speaker. Just a few syllables, indistinct and unsettling. Then, silence, just the hiss of static. I frowned. That was odd. I tried to boost the signal, turning the volume up, adjusting the antenna. The static only intensified. It felt wrong, like forcing something that didn't want to be heard. Then I remembered. That list. That impression of a rule. Something about interference, about not trying to fix it, about a location, a specific location. It wasn't a clear memory, just a sense of unease, a fragment of a warning. Log the location and time. Don't boost the signal. The words weren't distinct. More a feeling of cold dread. I dismissed it immediately, a bad connection. Old equipment. I was letting that room get to me. I needed fresh air. But then I looked at the radio again, and I realized where I was standing, just past the supply closet. In the hallway leading to room 307, the static was loudest here. I took a step back, towards the main corridor. The static lessened. I stopped. It lessened further. Another step, almost gone. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:47 a.m. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thick and cold. I logged the time and location in the incident report, a brief clinical entry. Radio interference experienced in East Wing hallway. Static. Brief unintelligible voice. Interference subsided upon moving away from location. No mention of the room. No mention of the feeling that had settled over me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Just the facts. I closed the logbook and left it on the security desk. I wouldn't mention it to Price. He'd just tell me I was imagining things. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I wasn't, and I knew somehow that this was just the beginning. I needed a stronger flashlight. Mine was starting to flicker. I was relabeling the film reels. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was quiet. Each reel was a little history, a snapshot of the state, old news footage, public service announcements, training films for state employees from the 1970s. They were stored alphabetically, and someone, years ago, hadn't been particularly meticulous about it. I was using a Dymo label maker, the kind with the rotating tape wheel. The click-clack of the keys was oddly soothing. The archive smelled like dust and vinegar, a peculiar combination that had become normal. Not pleasant exactly, but familiar. The reels were heavy, surprisingly so. Each one felt like it contained more than just film, more like a weight of expectation of forgotten stories. I was working my way through the 30s section, mostly agricultural documentaries, soybean production in the Midwest, the modern dairy farm, pest control for apple orchards. It was mind-numbingly boring, but it paid the bills. It kept Selma's medication covered. I pictured her now probably trying to read, or maybe watching some old movie. She liked the classics. I paused, stretching my back. It had been a long shift, and my lower back was starting to ache. I checked my phone. 10:32 p.m. I was almost halfway through. I scrolled through my contacts, just out of habit. My daughter Emily, my brother Zane, Price, the day shift guard, Selma, and then I stopped. Something was off. Every single contact, every single name in my phone showed the same number. A 10-digit string I didn't recognize. It wasn't a local number. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. I refreshed the contacts list, still the same. Emily, Zane, Price, Selma, all the same number. A wave of nausea rolled over me. It had to be a glitch. A software update gone wrong. My phone was an older model, a hand-me-down from Emily. It wasn't exactly known for its reliability. Probably just a bug. I deleted a contact and re-added it. The same number appeared, I tried another, and another, each time the same result. Then I remembered the list. The one I'd found in the orientation packet. That rambling, almost paranoid document. Something about backups. Something about digital systems being unreliable. Something about keeping a handwritten list of emergency contacts. It wasn't a clear memory, just a vague impression, a feeling of precaution. The document had sounded ridiculous at the time, the kind of thing a conspiracy theorist would write. But now, it was probably nothing. A phone glitch, a software error, a coincidence. I was letting that room, that hallway, get to me again. I was starting to see patterns where there weren't any. I was tired. I hadn't slept properly in days, but the feeling persisted, a knot tightening in my stomach. That list felt less ridiculous now. It felt necessary. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small notepad and pen I'd been given on my first day. I dismissed it as pointless bureaucracy, another layer of needless paperwork. Now, I flipped to a clean page and started to write. Emily, Zane, Price, Selma, each name, followed by their correct phone number, carefully copied from my memory. It felt absurd, like preparing for something I couldn't even name. But I kept writing. As I finished the last number, a low hum filled the room. It wasn't loud, more a vibration I felt in my teeth. It reminded me of the feeling from the first night, that high-frequency resonance that made my skin crawl. The lights flickered, momentarily dimming before returning to their usual fluorescent glow. The hum intensified slightly. I glanced towards room 307. The air around the door seemed to shimmer. I closed the notepad, my hand trembling slightly. I didn't want to look at that room. I didn't want to acknowledge what I was feeling, but I couldn't ignore the vibration, or the lights, or the fact that my phone was still displaying the same wrong number for every single contact. I tucked the notepad into my shirt pocket, close to my skin. It felt safe somehow, a small piece of reality in a world that was rapidly becoming distorted. I grabbed my flashlight and walked towards the security desk. I needed to call Price. I needed to tell him something was wrong. But I didn't call him on my phone. I used the landline. The connection was clear. Price answered on the second ring, and when I asked him if he could hear me, his voice sounded distant. Faint. Like it was coming from the other side of a long tunnel. He said, "Kieran? Is that you? I'm having trouble hearing you." The connection is terrible. He gave me his correct number, and I wrote it down on the notepad right under Selma's. I would need a new pen. This one was running out of ink. I was cataloging the microfiche records. It wasn't glamorous, but it was methodical. Each reel a tiny window into the past, each image a faded echo of lives lived. The archive held everything: property deeds, birth certificates, old tax records. Mostly it was dull, but occasionally you'd stumble across something interesting. A photograph of a long-forgotten town picnic, a handwritten letter from a soldier during the war. It was a quiet way to spend a few hours, and right now, quiet was exactly what I needed. The microfiche reader hummed, a low, consistent drone. The room was cool, kept at a steady temperature to preserve the material. I'd adjusted the thermostat earlier, bumping it up 1 degree. I was starting to feel a chill, even with the cardigan I'd brought. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something papery and old, like dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable. I was on Reel 47, indexing property records from 1923. The names blurred together: Henderson, Miller, O'Connell. Each entry meticulously recorded, each transaction a small piece of someone's story. It was hypnotic in a way. I lost track of time, my focus narrowing to the tiny images on the screen. Around 10:45, I needed to refill my coffee. I'd made a fresh pot before starting my shift, and it was getting low. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked towards the break room. The fluorescent lights flickered as I passed, a familiar annoyance. I made a mental note to report it to maintenance. Again, it had been flickering for weeks. Probably just a bad bulb. That's when I saw it. Room 218, the door was closed, which wasn't unusual. It was a small storage room used for overflow from the main collection, but the door, it was locked. And not with a key, but with an old-fashioned bolt lock, the kind you'd find on a barn door. It was locked from the inside. My first thought was that one of the daytime staff had used it to store something and forgotten to unlock it. Maybe Uwe, he was always misplacing things, or Kit, but then I remembered. Room 218 wasn't scheduled for use today, and the list, the orientation document, that passage about rooms locked from the inside. It wasn't a clear memory, more like an impression. Something about not forcing entry, something about marking the door and waiting. It was probably nothing. A faulty latch, someone playing a prank. I was letting the atmosphere of this place get to me. I was looking for something to be afraid of. This job was already stressing me out enough with the bills piling up. I didn't need to manufacture anxieties. But the document, the unnerving specificity of it. I walked over to the supply closet and grabbed a roll of yellow caution tape and a marker. I carefully taped off the doorway to room 218, creating a clear barrier. Then, using the marker, I wrote "Do not enter locked from inside," 11 p.m. on the tape. I checked my watch, 10:58. Close enough. I returned to the microfiche, trying to refocus on the property records, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to room 218, to the locked bolt, to the unsettlingly clear instruction in the document. I kept glancing over, half expecting the door to open, someone to emerge, explaining everything away. But nothing happened. The rest of the night passed slowly. I did my rounds, checking the fire exits, the security cameras. Everything seemed normal. The vibration hadn't returned. The radio was silent. The only sound was the hum of the microfiche reader and the occasional creak of the building settling. Finally, 6 a.m. arrived. My shift was over. I walked back to room 218, my stomach twisting with a strange anticipation. I expected to find the door still locked, the yellow tape still in place. I expected to have to fill out a report, explain the situation to Price. But the door was open. Not forced open, not broken, just open. The bolt was retracted. The yellow tape hung limp against the wall. The room was empty, completely empty. No signs of entry, no signs of disturbance, just bare shelves and a lingering scent of dust. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. I swept the light across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Nothing. I checked behind the shelves in the corners. Nothing. It was as if the room had never been locked at all. I checked the bolt again. It moved smoothly, easily. It hadn't been tampered with. It hadn't been forced. It had simply been unlocked. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the empty room. A cold dread washed over me. settling deep in my bones. It wasn't just the locked door. It wasn't just the fact that it had unlocked itself. It was the absence of anything, of any explanation. I left the room, carefully retaping the doorway, not as a warning this time, but as a marker, a reminder. I didn't report it to Price. What could I say? The room unlocked itself. He'd think I was losing my mind. I didn't need any more problems. Instead, I made a new entry in my notepad under the list of emergency contacts. A single line written in shaky handwriting. Room 218, unlocked 6:03 a.m. Then I headed home, the chill from the archive clinging to my skin, and the smell of dust following me all the way. I needed to talk to my wife. I needed to tell her something wasn't right, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what I felt, just empty, like the room. The fluorescent lights in the records room always hummed, a high-pitched whine that usually faded into background noise after a while. Tonight, though, it felt sharper, like someone had turned up the treble. I was cataloging boxes of old property deeds, mostly from the early 20th century. Tedious work, but it kept my hands busy and my mind mostly off things. Off the bills, off Selma's appointments, off the unsettling quiet of the archive. Each deed was a small rectangle of brittle parchment, tied with faded ribbon. I had to log the grantor, the grantee, the date, the parcel number, the usual. The air in the records room was always cold, even colder than the rest of the building. I'd asked Price about it, and he just shrugged and said something about the concrete foundation and the lack of direct sunlight. I'd pulled my cardigan tighter and left it at that. I wasn't getting paid enough to argue about the thermostat. The vibration, too, was back. Not constant, just a fleeting tremor that ran through the floor and up my legs every few minutes. I'd gotten used to it, or at least I'd learned to ignore it. It wasn't painful, just unnerving, like standing near a subway line. I was halfway through the third box, carefully unfolding a deed from 1928, when I noticed a file cabinet I hadn't seen before. It wasn't in the archive's inventory. I'd memorized the layout of this room after a week of shifts. I knew where every shelf, every box, every piece of furniture was supposed to be. This cabinet, a dark steel thing with no identifying marks, definitely wasn't. It was tucked into the corner, behind a stack of larger, clearly labeled boxes. It blended into the shadows, almost seemed to want to be hidden. I finished documenting the deed and stood up, stretching my back. My knees popped. I walked over to the cabinet, my flashlight beam landing on the tarnished metal. It was locked, a simple key lock. I didn't have a key for it. Of course I didn't. I ran my hand along the side, feeling for any sort of label, any indication of what it contained. Nothing, just cold, smooth steel. I checked my keyring, just in case. Nothing that looked remotely right. I thought about Price. I could ask him in the morning. But something about the cabinet, the way it was hidden, the way it just appeared, felt wrong. Like asking Price would be the wrong move. A little voice in the back of my head started whispering about the room. 218 about how things just changed. I dismissed it, though. I was tired, stressed about Selma's latest hospital bill. It was easy to let my imagination run wild in a place like this. Just an old cabinet, probably filled with outdated forms or something equally mundane. But then I remembered something. A fragment, really. From the orientation document, something about access, about not accessing things without permission. It wasn't a clear memory, more of a feeling, a warning, something about specific records being restricted. I couldn't recall the exact wording. I hadn't paid enough attention when reading it. I'd been more focused on the part about the analog backups, about keeping a handwritten list. But the feeling was strong, a pressure in my chest. Don't look. I turned away from the cabinet, intending to go back to the property deeds, to pretend I hadn't even seen it. But my hand, almost of its own accord, reached into my pocket and pulled out the small set of lockpicks I'd kept from my woodworking days. Old habit. A little bit of security, even when I wasn't building anything. I hadn't touched them in months. I told myself it was just curiosity, just a quick peek. I could open it, see what was inside, and then relock it, no harm done. I rationalized it as a way to alleviate the anxiety, to prove to myself it was nothing important, a harmless distraction. But even as I told myself this, My fingers were already working on the lock. The tiny tools felt awkward in my hands, unused. The tumblers clicked. 1, 2, 3. The lock sprang open with a soft snick. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. A wave of nausea washed over me. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hand. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, there were files, hundreds of them. Each one labeled with a name. Names of people who had worked at the archive, people who had worked here before me. I recognized some of them from the staff photos I'd seen in the break room, but most of the files were old, very old. I pulled one at random, a man named Ira Henderson. He'd been a records clerk here in the 1950s. The file contained his employment history, his performance reviews, his medical records, and then, at the very end, a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note. It was short, barely legible. They told me not to look. I should have listened. I slammed the drawer shut. A sudden sharp pain flared in my temples. The humming of the fluorescent lights intensified, vibrating in my skull. I backed away from the cabinet, knocking over a stack of boxes. Deeds scattered across the floor. I didn't bother to pick them up. I didn't need to see any more. I didn't need to know what Ira Henderson had looked at. I didn't need to know what had happened to him. The orientation document hadn't mentioned a key. It hadn't mentioned lockpicks. It hadn't mentioned anything about this cabinet. It just said, "Don't access," and I had. I left the records room, leaving the cabinet open, the files exposed. I didn't bother with the yellow tape. Didn't bother with anything. I just walked back to the security desk, sat down and stared at the blank security monitor. The room felt colder now, the vibration stronger, and the humming, it wasn't just in the lights anymore. It was inside my head. There was a new smell, too. Not dust, not decay, something metallic, something ancient. And I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever Ira Henderson had seen, it was still here, waiting. I was inventorying the microfiche collection. Row 7, Section C, mostly property records from the 1920s, deeds and mortgages, that sort of thing. It was tedious but predictable. The machine hummed, the little screen flickered, and I scanned each brittle card, logging it into the handwritten ledger. Selma had shown me the system when I started. She said it was old school but reliable. Reliable was good. Reliable paid the bills. The archive was quiet, as usual. The central heating kicked on and off with a clunk and a rush of warm air, making the old building groan. It smelled like dust and paper, and something faintly floral, like potpourri someone had forgotten about decades ago. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. I'd gotten used to it. The vibration was still there, a constant thrumming in the floor and under my feet, but it had become background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator at home. You tune it out. I had a knot in my lower back, though. Been sitting for too long. I should have stretched before I started. My wife, Carol, is always telling me to stretch. She's a physical therapist, so she's annoyingly right about these things. I promised her I'd start doing yoga with her on weekends. I hadn't. The rocking chair was coming along, slowly. The legs were finished, sanded smooth. I just needed to tackle the back. Walnut was a pain to work with, but it was worth it. She deserves something nice. I reached for the next stack of microfiche, and that's when I noticed. I was facing the north wall, just staring at it. It was a long blank wall, covered in faded green paint. Nothing remarkable about it, but I couldn't remember turning to face it. I distinctly recalled looking down at the ledger, then reaching for the next stack. My body hadn't registered the shift in direction. It was unsettling, but I wrote it off to being tired. A trick of the light, a lapse in attention. I'd been staring at tiny images for the last 2 hours. My brain was probably just filling in the gaps. The feeling faded quickly. I returned to the microfiche, but the image on the screen blurred. I blinked, adjusted the focus, and tried again. Still blurred. I glanced at the machine. The bulb was fine. Then I felt it again, the vibration stronger this time, and a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. And a pull, a subtle urging to look back at the wall. I shook my head. It was ridiculous. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. All this talk about the locked cabinet and Ira Henderson was getting to me. I needed to focus. I needed to finish this inventory. I needed to get home to Carol. I forced myself to look back at the microfiche, to concentrate on the details of the property record. but the urge persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. Then I remembered something from the orientation. Something I hadn't paid much attention to at the time. Something about not facing certain directions for too long. Not staring. It wasn't a direct instruction, more of a caution. A vague warning. Something about becoming visible. I couldn't recall the exact phrasing. It had been buried in pages of procedural guidelines. But the gist of it was there. Don't stay still, facing something. I glanced up again. The north wall. I hadn't moved. I'd been staring at it for what felt like a minute, maybe longer. It wasn't a conscious decision. My gaze had simply locked on. The prickling on my neck intensified. I felt a wave of nausea, similar to what I'd experienced with the cabinet, only this felt different, more urgent. I needed to check the loading dock. It was part of my rounds. I was supposed to do a sweep every 2 hours. I was overdue. I could justify it. Security protocol. But the loading dock was at the west end of the building. To get there, I would have to turn my back to the north wall. I hesitated. It felt wrong, like breaking a rule even though I couldn't articulate exactly what the rule was. But the loading dock? There was a faulty sensor there. It had been triggering false alarms on the digital system. I'd reported it, but maintenance hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. If it triggered another alarm, Price, the day shift supervisor, would be on my case. And Price was not a man you wanted on your case. He was a stickler for rules, and he had a knack for making your life miserable. I needed to check that sensor. I forced myself to turn my entire body, pivoting on my feet, keeping my gaze fixed on the hallway leading to the West Wing. It felt awkward, unnatural, like I was defying some unseen force. As I walked, I could still feel the pull, the urge to look back at the wall. I resisted, focusing on the chipped paint and the flickering fluorescent lights. The loading dock was quiet. The sensor was blinking red, as expected. I reset it, logged the incident in the handwritten logbook. The digital system was still unreliable, thanks to that analog backup rule, and started to head back to the microfiche room. As I passed the personnel records room, I noticed something. The door to room 218, the one that had been locked from the inside, was open, wide open, and the bolt lock was gone. I stopped dead in my tracks. I hadn't touched that lock. I hadn't even been near that room since I'd secured it. It was just open and empty. The vibration felt like it was coming from inside now, a low, insistent hum. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I had a very bad feeling, and I knew with a growing dread that checking the loading dock hadn't been the important thing to do. I'd prioritized Price over something else, something I couldn't name, something I should have faced. I stood in the periodical storage room, pulling bound volumes of the State Gazette from the top shelves. It was tedious work, but necessary. A request from Selma in records. Something about land deeds from 1938. I stacked the volumes on a rolling cart, trying to keep the weight balanced. The air in here was thick with dust and the scent of aging paper. It always made my sinuses itch. I'd been meaning to ask Price about getting a better filtration system, but I doubted it would be a priority. The building was quiet, predictably. The low hum of the ventilation system was the only consistent sound. It was a different kind of quiet than at home. Though at home, quiet meant Carol asleep on the couch, the TV muted. Here, it felt contained, like the silence was being actively maintained, not simply existing. I tried to shake off the thought. I needed to focus on getting these newspapers cataloged. Each volume had to be individually logged, cross-referenced, and returned to its designated spot. It was mind-numbing, but it paid the bills. I reached for another volume, stretching to reach the highest shelf. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound above me. Not loud, but distinct, like something dragging across metal. It wasn't the ventilation. That was a consistent drone. This was different. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I paused, holding the volume halfway up, listening intently. It came again, a short, metallic rasp, followed by a faint echo. It sounded like it was coming from the ceiling, directly above me. The storage room had a high vaulted ceiling with exposed ductwork and a network of catwalks used for maintenance. I hadn't been up there since my initial walkthrough with Ira. He'd warned me against it, said it wasn't structurally sound in places, and definitely not for unauthorized personnel. Honestly, it was probably just a rat. Or a bird. This building was old. There were bound to be critters getting into the rafters. It was just my imagination running wild, fueled by too much coffee and the general creepiness of this place. I was letting Ira's stories about the Henderson case get to me again. I was projecting. I needed a vacation. I really needed a vacation. I started to lift my head, just to get a better look. To confirm it was nothing, to prove to myself it was just a rat. But then I remembered that fragment from the document, something about looking up, not looking up unnecessarily, a vague warning about drawing attention, about being observed. I didn't remember the specifics, but the feeling was strong, an instinctive pull to not. I forced myself to stay focused on the shelf, to retrieve the next volume. My neck ached from keeping my head down. It felt unnatural. I was practically hunching over, but I couldn't bring myself to look up. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, and then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like something shifting its weight. My fingers fumbled with the volume, knocking another one slightly askew. It teetered on the edge of the shelf, threatening to fall. I reached out to steady it instinctively, and that's when I felt it. The vibration, not the subtle hum I'd become accustomed to, the one that seemed to permeate the entire building, but a sharp, localized tremor. It ran up my arm, making my teeth ache. It was strongest in my left hand, the one closest to the ceiling. I dropped the volume I was holding. It landed on the floor with a dull thud, scattering dust motes in the air. I didn't even register the sound. I was too focused on the vibration, on the feeling that something was aware of me, not in a threatening way exactly, but present, watching, and the scraping sound continued, relentless. I had to finish cataloging these newspapers. Selma was expecting them by the end of my shift. I needed to get this done quickly and efficiently, but I also needed to know what was making that noise. I glanced sideways towards the door. Maybe I could call Price, tell him there was a possible maintenance issue, but Price would just tell me to check it myself. He always did, and the thought of going near that ceiling, of looking up. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. It was just a building, an old, dusty building with a few creaky pipes and a possible rodent problem. Nothing more. I grabbed the fallen volume, ignoring the tremor that still lingered in my hand. I needed to get back to work. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. I reached for the next volume, stretching again, and as I did, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. Not above me, but across the room, near the entrance. Someone had left a maintenance cart blocking the doorway. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't a big deal, just an inconvenience. But it felt wrong, deliberate, like it was meant to obstruct my view, or delay me, and the scraping sound finally had stopped. The silence felt heavier now, more watchful. I carefully placed the volume on the cart, the vibration now a dull throb in my wrist. I had a feeling I wasn't alone in that room, and that the next sound wouldn't be coming from above. The walk to my car felt longer than usual, even though it couldn't have been. The parking lot was empty, just like always. I double-checked the locks on the archive doors as I left, a habit I'd picked up during my last few shifts. Though it wasn't strictly part of the protocol, Price would probably roll his eyes if he knew. He'd say I was wasting time, but it felt necessary. The drive home was quiet. I turned off the radio. Static had become irritating even outside the building. It wasn't that I expected to hear anything specific, just that the silence felt cleaner, safer maybe. I kept my eyes on the road, and my hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than they needed to. I'd noticed I did that more now, just a firmer grip. When I got home, Lena was already asleep. The TV was on muted, casting a pale blue light across the living room. I moved slowly, trying not to wake her. The house felt small, even smaller than before. I used to find it comforting, cozy. Now it felt contained, like a box. I checked the front window lock, then the back door. Another new habit. I hadn't been particularly security conscious before. I figured it was the stress, the bills, the constant worry about Lena's MS progressing. It made me see threats everywhere. I told myself that's all it was, just heightened anxiety. I started making a list, not of contacts this time, but of things that needed to be fixed around the house. The leaky faucet, the cracked tile in the bathroom, the loose banister on the stairs. Small things, things I've been putting off for months, But now making the list felt urgent. Like if I didn't get those things done, something bad would happen. It was ridiculous, I knew. Completely irrational. But I couldn't shake the feeling that order was important. That everything needed to be in its place. I'd almost finished the list when I realized I hadn't checked the attic access panel in the hallway. It was a small, square door set into the ceiling. We rarely used the attic. It was mostly just storage for old boxes and holiday decorations, but I remembered suddenly how easily it could be opened from above. From somewhere unseen. I stood there for a moment staring at the panel. It was probably just my imagination, running wild. But I climbed onto a chair and pulled down the string. The panel swung open with a groan. Empty. Just dust and darkness. I closed it and locked it with a small latch I hadn't known was there. I hadn't even remembered seeing that latch before. The next morning, I went to Uwe's woodworking shop. I hadn't touched my tools in over a week. I needed to work on the rocking chair for Lena. It was a distraction, a way to feel productive. Uwe asked me how the job at the archive was going. I told him it was fine, quiet, boring. I didn't mention the noises, the vibrations, the everything else. What was I going to say? That I was convinced an old building was subtly trying to tell me something? He'd think I was losing my mind. I spent the afternoon sanding the wood, trying to focus on the smooth curves of the chair. But my eyes kept drifting to the ceiling, to the rafters. I couldn't help it. Every time I looked up, and I found myself doing it constantly, instinctively, a little jolt of something unpleasant would run through me. Not fear, exactly. More like discomfort, a physical reaction, a tightening in my chest. It took me a long time to realize that's what was happening, that I was physically reacting to looking up. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that I was tired, that I needed a break, but it didn't work. I kept glancing upwards, testing it, each time, the same sensation. Now, months later, I still find myself adjusting my gaze when I enter a room. I don't consciously think about it. It's just automatic. If I'm standing near a window, I'll subtly lower my chin. If I'm in a room with a high ceiling, I'll focus on something at eye level. It's a small thing, insignificant really. No one else would notice, but I do, and I always will. Today, I was in the hardware store, picking up screws for a small repair. I walked past the paint section, and for a moment, I paused. I hadn't realized the ladders were there, leaning against the wall, reaching almost to the ceiling. I felt that familiar tightening, the small internal flinch, and without thinking, I turned my head slightly, lowering my gaze to the paint cans on the shelves. I spent an extra 5 minutes comparing shades of beige, even though I already knew what color I wanted. It wasn't a conscious decision, it just happened, and I knew, with a cold certainty, that someone else would be taking that job at the archive soon. Someone else who wouldn't know what to listen for.